Welcome to my channel. This is Captain BinoyVarakil, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Joseph's College, Varakil. We are in the lecture series on Longinus Treatise on the Sublime, and this is the final lecture on the Sublime of Longinus. This is lecture number 6, and in this lecture we discuss why we consider Longinus as a romantic critic. Rather, we have a question like who called Longinus the first romantic critic? Why? It is of course Scott James. Scott James called Longinus the first romantic critic, and we are discussing the reasons for Scott James to consider Longinus the first romantic critic. Okay, or rather this is Longinus Romanticism. Maybe exam point of view, remember you can have a paragraph question or even an essay question like write a paragraph on Longinus Romanticism. Why do you consider, can you consider, or why does Scott James consider Longinus the first romantic critic? Okay, so with Longinus, the classical criteria of literary perfection underwent a change. It had been supposed hitherto by the Greek and Roman critics alike that if a writer followed the rules of art as deduced from the practice of the ancient masters, he could with due help from nature attain to perfection. The whole tendency of classical criticism is in this direction. The provision of large numbers of positive rules inevitably suggests to the feebler minds at any rate that if you do not break these rules, it will be all right with you. Much of Longinus on criticism follows this very line. His attempt to reduce sublimity to the dry bonds of rule and precepts, and the injunctions he lays down for the use of the artistic aids to sublimity, which read like those laid down by Aristotle, Horace, Quintilian, and the rest, but at least in 3 ways. Remember, in 3 ways Longinus breaks with this tradition, and his new test of literary excellence or sublimity is transport is the first reason to consider him a romanticist. So transport is the greatness of a literary work to transform, or rather to move the reader or the listener to great pleasure or ecstasy or exaltation. So instruction, delight, and persuasion, all of which kept the reader within the bounds of reason, summed up the classical ideal of literary perfection. Into this, Longinus introduces the storm and fury of romantic movement by admitting the full play of the passions in the production of a masterpiece. This freedom is the very basis of the romantic temper. Secondly, as stated earlier, Longinus protests against the traditional limitation of the number of metaphors to not more than 2 at a time is in a romantic strain. Finally, while the classicists judged a work by its faultlessness or close conformity to rules, Longinus sees no merit in it if it does not at the same time lead to sublimity. The observance of the rules consequently is no criterion of perfection, and this is what Romanticism much later will say too. And Scott James therefore rightly calls Longinus the first romantic critic. Now we have to discuss the value of Longinus criticism. Alright, so when we discuss on the Sublime, we have to keep in mind these 5 important topics or ideas like what is sublimity, and everybody knows sublimity. It can be just defined like sublimity is this certain distinction and excellence in writing, and transport is another concept. Transport, we know that it is of course it is the result of sublimity. Result of sublimity is transport, and transport is the capacity or the potential of a sublime work to give happiness to, or great pleasure, or exaltation or ecstasy to the reader. Transport. Okay, and next is sources of sublime. We have 5 sources of sublime. And why do we consider Longinus as a romantic critic? And of course, the 5th point is, it is of course David Deitch's observation on the sublime shows radically different approach from Aristotle. Okay, so do you agree with the fact that on the sublime shows radically different approach from Aristotle? Okay, so that is, of course, we have poetics. In poetics, Aristotle just speaks about tragedy, and he says that tragedy is of course an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, of course in the form of action rather than narration. And we have that reference to, of course, through pity and fear resulting a catharsis or purgation, all right, purification, right? So maybe we just cannot just agree with the very concept of David Deitch, right? On the sublime shows radically different approach from Aristotle. It is rather same, because tragedy should create pity and fear, says Aristotle. Similarly, the sublime work Longinus's should transport the reader, and that concept of transport or sublimity, great work, and of course purgation, catharsis, purification, pity and fear. Okay, there is some kind of similarity. All right, so we cannot agree as such with the very statement of David Deitch is that on the sublime shows radically different approach from Aristotle. All right, now we just look at the value of Longinus criticism. What is the significance of or value of on the sublime? It has already been stated that much of what Longinus says had been said by others before him. In his remarks on the use of figures, choice of words, ornamentation of language, and artistic arrangement of the whole, he follows Aristotle and the rest. These were more or less the commonplaces of the art of rhetoric, which every rhetorician had to take a note of. In his scientific approach too, he resembles Aristotle. He says nothing that he has not fully observed and analyzed for himself, but in his main thesis, his theory of transport, he rises above all his predecessors, Greek or Roman. Here, he transcends all rules and pleads for a purely aesthetic appreciation of literature. He admires the Greek classics not because they observe the rules of their kind. Sometimes they do not, but because they excite, move, transport, or elevate. And any art that does so is sublime, even though it might be faulty in form. Homer is great for all his formal blemishes. Longinus, therefore, is still for the Greek standards of excellence, but he measures these more by their spirit than their form. To catch the former, which is elusive, is a higher thing than to imitate the latter, which is just a matter of rule and compass. This is love of the classics with a difference, aesthetic rather than formal, romantic rather than classical. But his aesthetics are ultimately grounded in the thoughts and emotions of noble minds. For none others can produce literature that is sublime. he sees an intimate connection between the greatness of soul and the greatness of speech. Here he shows himself a disciple of Plato, to whom also excellence in art was but a reflection of excellence of character. Longinus, thus, is three characters in one: a classicist in taste, a romanticist in temper, and an idealist at heart. His conception of sublimity partakes of each of these three elements. Through it, he interprets classicism anew to his own age, offers a hand to the future romanticists, and gives a meaning and purpose to art by allying it with what is noblest in human nature. Okay, so with this we come to the end of the discussion of the treatise on the Sublime by Longinus. Remember, we have 6 lectures in this series, and if you haven't listened or watched the previous 5 lectures, please go back to those lectures and have a very comprehensive idea of what Longinus tells about on the Sublime or sublimity in literature. Thanks a lot for listening. May God bless you. Bye-bye.